The sound of my purse hitting the marble floor echoed through the silent dining room like a gunshot. As the contents scattered across my mother's pristine tiles, I watched in slow motion as a small leather wallet flipped open, revealing the unmistakable gold shield that would change everything my family thought they knew about me. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The judgment in my family had been brewing for 3 years, simmering like a pot left too long on the stove, ready to boil over at any moment. Every family gathering became an interrogation disguised as concern, every phone call a reminder of my apparent failures. They saw what they wanted to see, their daughter, sister, and cousin, who had somehow lost her way after college, settling for what they perceived as a meaningless job that barely paid the bills. Sarah Mitchell was supposed to be the success story. Valedictorian of her high school class, full scholarship to Georgetown University, double major in criminal justice and psychology with a minor in computer science. I graduated summa cum laude, had 3 job offers waiting before I even walked across that stage. My parents had already started bragging to their friends about their daughter, who would probably end up as a high-powered attorney or maybe even a judge someday. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. The first curveball came during my senior year when Professor Reynolds, my criminal justice advisor, pulled me aside after class. He was a former FBI agent himself, 25 years in the bureau before transitioning to academia. His weathered face and sharp eyes had seen things that most people only read about in newspapers or watched in movies. "Sarah, I've been watching your work this semester," he said, his voice carrying that authoritative tone that made even the most rebellious students straighten up. "Have you ever considered federal law enforcement?" The question caught me off guard. I'd always imagined myself in a courtroom, not chasing criminals through dark alleys. But something about the way he said it, the respect in his voice when he mentioned the bureau, planted a seed that would grow into something I never expected. 3 weeks later, I found myself in the FBI field office in Washington, D.C., sitting across from Special Agent Catherine Wells. She was everything I thought an FBI agent should be: confident, intelligent, with an air of authority that commanded respect without being intimidating. Her questions were sharp, probing not just my academic achievements but my character, my motivations, my ability to handle pressure. "This isn't a job, Sarah," she told me as our interview wrapped up. "It's a calling. Once you're in, there's no halfway. The bureau becomes part of who you are, not just what you do." I thought I understood what she meant. I was wrong. The application process alone took 8 months. Background checks that went deeper than I thought possible. Interviews with people I hadn't spoken to since middle school. Psychological evaluations that felt like they were peeling back layers of my soul. My family knew I was applying for a government job, but I kept the details vague. Looking back, maybe I should have been more honest from the beginning. When the acceptance letter arrived, I stared at it for a full 10 minutes before reality sank in. I was going to Quantico. I was going to become an FBI agent. The 20 weeks of training were unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Physical fitness requirements that pushed my body to its absolute limits. Firearms training that transformed me from someone who'd never held a gun to someone who could hit a target at 50 yards with deadly accuracy. Tactical exercises that taught me how to think like both hunter and hunted. But it was the mental preparation that really changed me. Learning to compartmentalize, to separate Sarah the daughter from Sarah the agent. Understanding that the work I'd be doing would require me to see things, experience things, that I could never fully share with the people I loved most. My graduation from the academy was one of the proudest moments of my life. My parents came, of course, beaming with pride as I took the oath. They understood then what I'd committed to, or at least they thought they did. What they didn't understand was what came next. My first assignment was to the Chicago field office, working in the white-collar crime division. To most people, that sounds glamorous, like something out of a television show. The reality was months of painstaking document review, following paper trails that led through shell companies and offshore accounts, building cases one piece of evidence at a time. But to my family, especially after I moved back to my hometown of Cedar Rapids, Iowa 6 months later, it looked like I'd given up on the fast track. They saw me working at what appeared to be a small, unremarkable office building downtown. They saw me keeping regular hours, coming home without exciting stories to tell. They saw someone who had settled for ordinary when she was capable of extraordinary. The cover story was simple. I worked for a small consulting firm that specialized in financial auditing. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did spend most of my time analyzing financial records. I just couldn't tell them that those records belonged to suspected money launderers, tax evaders, and organized crime figures. My assignment in Cedar Rapids wasn't random. The Bureau had been tracking a sophisticated money laundering operation that stretched from Chicago through several Midwest cities, with Cedar Rapids serving as an unexpected hub. A local businessman named Robert Thornton had built what appeared to be a legitimate empire of small businesses, car washes, laundromats, restaurants, but our intelligence suggested they were fronts for washing millions in illegal proceeds. Working undercover in a small city presented unique challenges. Unlike a big city where anonymity was easy, everyone in Cedar Rapids seemed to know everyone else. I had to be Sarah Mitchell, the hometown girl who'd come back after college, not Special Agent Mitchell of the FBI. The hardest part wasn't maintaining my cover with strangers. It was maintaining it with my own family. My younger brother Jake was the first to start the commentary. He'd graduated from Iowa State with a business degree and landed a position at a regional bank that he never tired of describing as on the fast track to management. At family dinners, he'd regale everyone with stories of client meetings and promotion opportunities, always making sure to ask about my little auditing job with a tone that made it clear he considered it beneath both of us. "I just don't understand why you're wasting your potential, Sarah," he said one Sunday over my mother's pot roast. "You were always the smart one. You could be making 6 figures at a law firm right now, instead of whatever it is you're doing." My sister Emma was pursuing her medical residency at the time, which gave her an even higher platform from which to judge my choices. She'd always been competitive, but my apparent career stagnation seemed to bring out a smugness in her that I'd never seen before. "Maybe it's not too late to go back to school," she suggested during one particularly brutal family gathering. "I mean, you're still young enough to start over. Plenty of people change careers in their 20s. The comments from extended family were even worse. My cousin David, who'd parlayed a communications degree into a job at a local television station, seemed to take particular pleasure in my perceived failure. At my uncle's birthday party, he spent 20 minutes explaining his quote, career trajectory before turning to me with mock concern. "So, Sarah, still doing the bookkeeping thing? That's nice. Really, it's important work. Someone has to do the unglamorous jobs, right?" But it was my parents' disappointment that cut the deepest. They never said it directly. They were too polite for that, but I could see it in their eyes, hear it in the way they talked about me to their friends. Their daughter who had so much promise, who could have been anything, and chose to be nothing special. My mother started making subtle suggestions about other opportunities. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned that the law firm downtown is looking for paralegals," she'd say while washing dishes. "It might be a good stepping stone, honey. You know, to get back on track." My father, always the pragmatist, was more direct. "Sarah, I just want to make sure you're thinking about your future. This job you have now, is there room for growth? Are you building toward something?" How could I tell him that I was building toward bringing down one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations the Midwest had seen in decades? How could I explain that my boring office job had already led to the seizure of $2 million in assets and was about to expose a network that reached into 3 states? The isolation was the hardest part, not just from my family but from any real connection to the community I was supposed to be protecting. I couldn't form genuine friendships because every relationship was potentially compromised by my real identity. I couldn't date because how do you explain why you carry a gun and why certain topics are off limits? I threw myself into the work instead. The Thornton investigation was revealing layers of complexity that impressed even the veteran agents I reported to in Chicago. What had started as a simple money laundering case was uncovering connections to drug trafficking, human trafficking, and political corruption that reached further than anyone had imagined. My cover job at the consulting firm was actually perfect for the investigation. As a financial auditor, I had legitimate reasons to request records, to ask probing questions about business practices, to notice discrepancies that might escape other observers. I spent months building relationships with local business owners, bank employees, and city officials, all while quietly documenting the intricate web of transactions that proved the scope of Thornton's operation. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday in March. I'd been tracking a series of cash deposits at 3 different banks, all just under the $10,000 reporting threshold, all traced back to businesses that should have been operating primarily on credit cards. When I cross-referenced the deposit times with surveillance footage the local police had been collecting for an unrelated case, I found something that made my pulse quicken. The same man was making deposits at all 3 banks within a 2-hour window, every Tuesday and Friday, for the past 6 months. But according to the business registrations, he shouldn't have had access to accounts at 2 of those banks. That evening, I sat in my apartment going over the evidence again, making sure I hadn't missed anything before I called my handler in Chicago. The case was bigger than we'd thought, and it was about to get a lot more dangerous. What I didn't know was that in less than 24 hours, my carefully constructed cover would be blown in the most unexpected way possible, in front of the very people whose opinion of me had driven me to take risks I should never have taken. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The next day would change everything, not just for the investigation, but for every relationship I'd spent 3 years trying to protect. The judgment, the condescension, the disappointed looks, all of it was about to be replaced by something I wasn't sure would be any easier to handle. But that night, staring at the evidence spread across my coffee table, I was still just Sarah Mitchell, the daughter who disappointed her family by settling for less than she was worth. Tomorrow they would learn exactly how wrong they'd been about what my life really meant. The morning of March 18th started like any other Wednesday in my carefully orchestrated double life. I woke up at 5:30 a.m., went for my usual 3-mile run through downtown Cedar Rapids, and arrived at the unremarkable beige building that housed our field office by 7:15. To anyone watching, I was just another office worker starting another mundane day. But today was different. Today, everything we'd been working toward for 18 months was about to culminate in a coordinated operation across 3 states. Special Agent Marcus Thompson had driven down from Chicago the night before, bringing with him a team of 6 agents and enough surveillance equipment to monitor a small army. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. We would execute simultaneous raids on 14 properties while I maintained my cover by conducting what appeared to be a routine audit at Thornton's primary business, Cedar Rapids Car Care. "Remember, Sarah," Marcus briefed me one final time as we reviewed the operation details. "Your job today is to keep Thornton calm and distracted. Let him think this is just another boring day with the auditor, while we dismantle his entire network around him." The weight of my concealed weapon felt heavier than usual as I drove to the car wash that morning. 3 years of meticulous work, hundreds of hours of documentation, and countless sleepless nights had all led to this moment. In less than 4 hours, Robert Thornton and 17 of his associates would be in federal custody, and one of the most sophisticated money laundering operations in the Midwest would be finished. Thornton was waiting for me with his usual fake smile and overly firm handshake. He was a man in his late 50s who'd mastered the art of appearing successful without being flashy. His clothes were expensive but conservative, his office decorated with local business awards and photos with minor politicians. To most people, he looked like the embodiment of Midwestern business success. "Sarah, good to see you again," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. "I've got all those quarterly reports you requested. Coffee?" For the next 2 hours, I played my part perfectly. We discussed revenue streams, employee payroll, and maintenance costs, while federal agents positioned themselves around his other properties. I asked detailed questions about cash flow irregularities, while SWAT teams prepared to breach doors across the city. I made notes about accounting discrepancies, while my colleagues gathered evidence that would put this man away for the rest of his life. At exactly 10:47 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text message that contained a single word, "Go." What happened next unfolded with the precision of a choreographed dance. As I continued discussing quarterly profit margins with Thornton, federal agents simultaneously entered his restaurant, two of his laundromats, a small construction company, and a trucking business. By 11:15, they had seized computers, hard drives, financial records, and enough cash to fill 3 evidence bags. Thornton's phone started ringing at 11:23. The first call, he ignored. The second call brought a frown to his face. By the fourth call, he was standing at his window, looking toward downtown, where sirens could be heard in the distance. "Excuse me for just a moment, Sarah," he said, stepping into the hallway to take the fifth call. I could hear his voice through the thin walls, controlled at first but growing increasingly agitated. When he returned to his office, his face had lost all color, and the confident businessman facade had cracked enough to reveal the criminal underneath. "I'm sorry, but we're going to have to reschedule," he said, already reaching for his car keys. "Something's come up that requires my immediate attention." That's when I made the decision that would change everything. Protocol dictated that I should let him leave, allow the other teams to handle his arrest when he inevitably showed up at one of his compromised properties. My job was to maintain cover until the operation was complete. But something in his eyes, a desperation I recognized from my training, told me he wasn't going to quietly surrender. Robert Thornton was going to run. "Actually, Mr. Thornton," I said, standing up and placing myself between him and the door, "I think we should finish our conversation first." The transformation was instantaneous. The mask dropped completely, and I found myself face to face with a man who'd spent decades staying one step ahead of law enforcement. His hand moved toward the desk drawer where I knew he kept a .38 revolver, discovered during one of my previous audits. "I don't know who you are," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "but I know you're not here about quarterly reports." My training kicked in. Time seemed to slow as I reached beneath my blazer and drew my service weapon, a Glock 19 that had been my constant companion for 3 years. The weight of it in my hands was familiar, comforting even, despite the gravity of the situation. "FBI, keep your hands where I can see them." The words felt strange coming out of my mouth after so many months of pretending to be someone else. For the first time in 3 years, I was completely, authentically myself. Thornton's eyes widened with a mixture of surprise and something that might have been respect. "Well, I'll be damned, the little auditor is fed." The standoff lasted less than 30 seconds before backup arrived. Marcus burst through the door with 2 other agents, weapons drawn, and the most dangerous part of my career was over as quickly as it had begun. But my relief was short-lived. As we waited for the transport vehicle to take Thornton into custody, my phone rang. It was my mother. "Sarah, honey, I know this is last minute, but could you possibly come by for dinner tonight? Your Aunt Linda is in town, and she's been asking about you. She'd love to hear about what you've been up to." Looking around at the chaos of the crime scene, at the federal agents processing evidence, at Robert Thornton in handcuffs, I almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. "Actually, Mom, I'm kind of tied up at work today. Rain check?" "Oh, come on, sweetie. How important could your auditing work really be? This is family." If she only knew. The aftermath of the operation was a whirlwind of debriefings, paperwork, and coordination with prosecutors across 3 states. We'd seized over $15 million in assets, arrested 19 people, and dismantled a criminal network that had been operating for nearly a decade. It was the kind of case that would define careers and make headlines, but I couldn't tell my family any of it. The irony wasn't lost on me. On the same day that I'd proven myself in the most dramatic way possible to my colleagues and superiors, I had to go home and continue being the disappointing daughter who couldn't amount to anything more than a small-town bookkeeper. Marcus pulled me aside as we wrapped up the initial processing. "Outstanding work, Sarah. The way you handled Thornton today, keeping him calm until the last second, then taking control when things went sideways, that's exactly the kind of judgment we need in this job." He paused, studying my face carefully. "I know maintaining cover in your hometown hasn't been easy. The Chicago office has been watching your work, and there's talk of a promotion, maybe a transfer to a position where you won't have to hide who you are anymore." The offer should have thrilled me. For 3 years, I dreamed of the day when I could be open about my real career, when I could finally earn the respect and recognition I'd sacrificed so much to achieve. But the thought of leaving Cedar Rapids, of never knowing if my family would ever understand what I'd really been doing all this time, filled me with unexpected sadness. That evening, I sat in my apartment staring at the commendation letter Marcus had given me, recognizing my, quote, exceptional service in support of a major federal investigation. 3 years of my life reduced to official language on bureau letterhead. 3 years of pretending to be less than I was, of accepting my family's disappointment, of watching my siblings surpass me in their eyes while I took down criminals they couldn't even imagine. I thought about calling my parents, about finding some way to hint at what had really happened that day. But operational security was sacred, and even though the immediate danger was over, the investigation would continue for months as prosecutors built their cases. The knock on my door at 9:30 that night surprised me. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the few friends I'd managed to maintain in Cedar Rapids usually called first. When I looked through the peephole and saw my brother Jake standing in the hallway, my heart sank. "Hey Sarah," he said when I opened the door. "Mom told me about dinner tonight. I thought maybe I'd stop by and see how you're doing." It was unlike him to make social calls, especially on a weeknight. Jake was usually too busy with his banking career to worry about his underachieving sister. But something in his expression suggested this wasn't a casual visit. "Actually," he continued, stepping into my living room, "I wanted to talk to you about something. There are rumors going around town about some kind of big federal investigation today. Arrests, raids, that kind of thing. Since you work downtown, I thought maybe you'd heard something." My blood ran cold. Jake worked at First National Bank, one of the institutions where Thornton's operation had been laundering money. If he'd heard rumors, how much did he know? How much did he suspect? "I didn't hear anything specific," I said carefully. "Why do you ask?" "Well, it's probably nothing, but one of our clients, Robert Thornton, missed a scheduled appointment today. When we called his office, they said he'd been arrested by federal agents. The whole thing has everyone at the bank pretty shaken up." I tried to keep my expression neutral, but inside my mind was racing. If Jake was asking questions, how long would it be before other family members started connecting dots? How long before someone noticed that their disappointment of a daughter seemed to know more about federal investigations than a small-town auditor should? "That does sound serious," I managed. "I hope it doesn't cause problems for the bank." Jake studied my face for a long moment, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing more than I wanted him to. "Yeah, me too. The whole thing is just weird, you know? Like there was this whole other world operating right under our noses, and we never suspected a thing." After he left, I couldn't shake the feeling that my carefully constructed cover was beginning to develop cracks. 3 years of perfect operational security, and now my own brother was asking questions I couldn't answer without compromising everything we'd worked for. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my couch, staring out at the lights of Cedar Rapids below. Somewhere out there, 17 defendants were spending their first night in federal custody because of work I'd done. Evidence I'd gathered would put dangerous criminals away for decades. Lives had been protected, justice had been served, and the rule of law had been upheld. But I was still just Sarah, the daughter who'd somehow lost her way after college. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions to deflect, new ways to appear ordinary, while doing extraordinary work. But tonight, for just a few hours, I allowed myself to feel proud of what I'd accomplished, even if no one else could ever know about it. What I didn't realize was that fate was about to take the choice of secrecy away from me entirely. In less than 48 hours, a simple family dinner would become the stage for a revelation that would change everything I thought I knew about keeping my two worlds separate. The badge in my purse felt heavier than usual as I finally headed to bed that night, as if it were trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. The call came at 6:43 a.m. on Friday morning, jolting me from the first decent sleep I'd managed since the operation began. Agent Thompson's voice was tense, urgent in a way that immediately put me on high alert. "Sarah, we've got a problem. Thornton's lawyer filed a motion yesterday afternoon claiming entrapment. He's alleging that his client was targeted by an undercover agent who exceeded the scope of her authority." I sat up in bed, instantly awake. What does that mean for the case? It means we need to be extra careful about documentation and procedure going forward. But there's something else. The motion specifically mentions your cover identity and questions whether proper protocols were followed in placing an agent in a small community where personal relationships could compromise objectivity. The implication hit me like a physical blow. Someone had leaked information about my true identity, and now Thornton's defense team was going to use my undercover status as a weapon against the prosecution. How much do they know? I asked, already dreading the answer. More than they should. The motion references specific details about your background, your family connections to the community, even mentions your brother's employment at First National. Sarah, I think we may have a bigger problem than just a defense strategy. After hanging up, I stared at the ceiling of my small apartment, my mind racing through possibilities. Either someone within the Bureau had leaked classified information, or someone in Cedar Rapids had put together pieces that should have been impossible to connect. The morning news broadcast confirmed my worst fears. Channel 7's lead story featured a grainy photograph of me entering the federal building in Chicago, with a banner reading, "Local woman revealed as undercover FBI agent." The reporter, a young woman I recognized from local events, spoke with barely contained excitement about the shocking revelation that a Cedar Rapids resident had been living a double life as a federal agent. My phone started ringing immediately. First my mother, then my father, then Emma calling from the hospital in Des Moines. I let them all go to voicemail, knowing that whatever I said would only make the situation worse. But Jake was persistent. He called 6 times before finally showing up at my door, looking disheveled and slightly frantic. "Sarah, what the hell is going on? I just saw the news, and they're saying you're some kind of federal agent. Please tell me this is some kind of mistake." Looking at my brother's face, seeing the confusion and hurt in his eyes, I realized that all the operational security in the world couldn't protect against the simple human need for truth. For 3 years, I'd protected him and the rest of my family from the reality of what I did, but in doing so, I'd also protected them from understanding who I really was. "It's not a mistake, Jake," I said quietly, inviting him inside. "I've been working undercover for the FBI for 3 years." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake stood in my living room, looking around as if seeing it for the first time, searching for clues he'd missed. His eyes landed on the small digital photo frame on my bookshelf, cycling through pictures that suddenly took on new meaning. "All this time," he said slowly, "when we thought you were just... when Mom and Dad were worried about you settling for less, you were actually..." "I was doing my job," I finished. "A job that required me to let you all think I was failing instead of succeeding." Jake slumped into my armchair, running his hands through his hair. "Jesus, Sarah, do you have any idea what this is going to do to Mom and Dad? They've been worried sick about you for 3 years. Dad's been losing sleep over whether he failed you somehow, whether they should have pushed you harder to live up to your potential." The guilt hit me harder than any physical blow. In all my careful planning, all my consideration of operational security and cover maintenance, I'd never fully considered the emotional toll my deception would take on the people who loved me most. "I couldn't tell you," I said, sitting across from him. "The work I was doing, the people we were investigating, if my cover had been blown, it wouldn't just have ended the operation. It could have put all of you in danger." "What kind of operation?" Jake asked, though his expression suggested he was beginning to piece together the answer. I told him everything I could without compromising ongoing prosecutions. The money laundering network, the 18-month investigation, the millions of dollars in illegal proceeds that had been flowing through businesses he passed every day on his way to work. When I mentioned Robert Thornton, Jake's face went pale. "Bob Thornton? The guy who sponsors the Little League teams? The one who gave a speech at the Chamber of Commerce dinner last month about community investment?" "The same one." "Jake, the money he was using for all that community involvement came from drug trafficking and human trafficking operations spanning 3 states. The legitimate businesses he ran were just ways to clean dirty money." Jake was quiet for a long time, processing information that challenged everything he thought he knew about his hometown. Finally, he looked up at me with something I hadn't seen in his eyes for 3 years. "Respect. So when we were all giving you grief about your dead-end job, you were actually taking down major criminals?" "I was doing my job," I repeated. The same job I've been doing since I graduated from Quantico. The same job that required me to listen to my own family talk about how disappointed they were in me because the alternative was compromising an investigation that could save lives. The sound of cars pulling into the parking lot drew our attention to the window. 3 news vans had arrived, their satellite dishes extending like mechanical flowers reaching for the sky. Reporters were setting up cameras, and I could see my neighbors beginning to gather, curious about the sudden media attention. "This is going to get worse before it gets better," I told Jake. "Once the prosecutors start presenting evidence, there are going to be details about the investigation that make headlines for weeks. My name, my cover story, maybe even details about our family. It's all going to be public record." Jake stood up and walked to the window, watching the growing circus below. "What do you need from us? From the family, I mean. How do we handle this?" The question surprised me. I'd expected anger, accusations, demands for explanations. Instead, my brother was asking how he could help protect me and the work I'd done. "I need you to understand that everything I told you about my job for the past 3 years was a lie, but everything I showed you about who I am as a person was real. I'm still the same sister you've known your whole life. I just happen to carry a badge and a gun while I'm protecting people like you." The knock on my door was sharp, authoritative. When I looked through the peephole, I saw Agent Thompson with 2 other agents I didn't recognize. "Sarah, we need to talk," Marcus said when I opened the door. "The situation has become more complicated." Jake started to leave, but Marcus gestured for him to stay. "Actually, Mr. Mitchell, we'd like to speak with you as well. We believe your bank may have been used to facilitate some of the transactions we're investigating, and we need to understand how much information may have been compromised." What followed was 3 hours of questioning that revealed the scope of the security breach. Someone had been systematically gathering information about my real identity for weeks, possibly months. Bank records, employment histories, even traffic camera footage had been analyzed to build a comprehensive picture of my activities. The leak wasn't coming from within the Bureau. It was coming from Thornton's organization, which had suspected they were under surveillance and had hired a private investigation firm to identify potential threats. "The good news," one of the agents explained, "is that they didn't discover your real identity until after the arrests were made. The bad news is that they've compiled enough information to seriously compromise any future undercover work you might do." Marcus pulled me aside while the other agents continued interviewing Jake. "Sarah, I'm going to be direct with you. Your cover in Cedar Rapids is completely blown. Not just with your family, but with the entire community. Within 48 hours, everyone in town is going to know who you really are and what you've been doing." I'd known this moment was coming from the second I saw the news report, but hearing it stated so bluntly still felt like a punch to the gut. "What are my options?" I asked. "Chicago wants you back immediately. There's a position in the financial crimes unit that would be perfect for your skills, and after this case, you've got the kind of credibility that opens doors. You could be running your own investigations within a year." The offer was everything I'd worked toward for 3 years. Recognition, advancement, the chance to do meaningful work without having to hide who I was or what I'd accomplished. It was the career I'd dreamed of when I first walked into the FBI field office as a scared college graduate. But it also meant leaving Cedar Rapids, leaving my family, leaving the community I'd spent 3 years protecting, even as they questioned my worth. "How long do I have to decide?" I asked. "Monday morning. The media attention is only going to get worse, and we need to get you somewhere secure, where you can focus on preparing for the trials without worrying about reporters camping outside your apartment." That evening, after the agents left and the immediate crisis had passed, Jake and I sat in my kitchen eating takeout Chinese food and trying to process everything that had happened. "I need to ask you something," Jake said, setting down his chopsticks, "and I want you to be completely honest with me." I nodded, bracing myself for whatever was coming. "When we were kids, and you used to talk about wanting to make a difference in the world, wanting to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, was that real? Or was that just something you said because you thought it sounded good?" The question caught me off guard. I'd expected him to ask about the deception, about why I'd let our family believe I was failing when I was actually succeeding beyond their wildest expectations. "It was real," I said. "It's always been real. Everything I've done, every choice I've made since college, has been about that same goal. The only difference is that I found a way to do it that you didn't recognize." Jake smiled for the first time since arriving at my apartment that morning. I always wondered why you seemed so calm about all the criticism, all the worry from Mom and Dad. I thought maybe you'd just given up on ambition. But you weren't calm because you'd given up. You were calm because you knew something we didn't. I knew I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do, I confirmed, even when it meant disappointing the people I love most. As we finished dinner, I could see the television crews packing up their equipment outside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions to answer, new ways to navigate a world where my secret was no longer secret. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, I was having an honest conversation with my brother about who I really was and what my life really meant. And despite everything that had gone wrong, everything that was about to change, that felt like the beginning of something better. The phone rang just as we were clearing the dishes. It was my mother, and her voice sounded different. Not the worried, disappointed tone I'd grown accustomed to, but something closer to awe. "Sarah, honey, your father and I just finished watching the news. We need to talk." Saturday morning arrived with an uncomfortable silence that seemed to blanket the entire city. The news crews had multiplied overnight, transforming my quiet residential street into a media circus complete with satellite trucks, camera crews, and reporters doing live broadcasts from my front lawn. I watched from behind my bedroom curtains as my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, gave what appeared to be an enthusiastic interview about the nice young woman who always helped with my groceries. The irony wasn't lost on me. Mrs. Patterson knew more about my character than my own family had for the past 3 years. My phone had been ringing constantly since dawn, but it was the call from my mother at 8:30 that I finally answered. "Sarah, your father and I need to see you today. We're not asking. We're telling. Family dinner at 5 o'clock, and this time you're going to tell us everything." Her tone brooked no argument. This wasn't the worried, disappointed mother I'd grown accustomed to. This was the woman who'd raised 3 children with an iron will disguised as gentle guidance, the same woman who'd once stared down a school principal who tried to tell her that girls shouldn't be in advanced mathematics classes. "Mom, with all the media attention, maybe we should wait until 5 o'clock, Sarah. Your sister is driving up from Des Moines, and Jake is bringing Rebecca. We're going to sit down as a family and figure out what the hell has been going on in our house for 3 years. The line went dead before I could respond. I spent the day in a strange limbo, fielding calls from prosecutors who needed to discuss testimony schedules, and reporters who somehow had my personal number. Agent Thompson called twice with updates on the security situation and to inform me that the Chicago transfer was being expedited due to safety concerns. "Sarah, we've identified at least 3 individuals connected to Thornton's organization who are still unaccounted for," he explained during his second call. "Until we locate them, we can't guarantee your safety in Cedar Rapids. The Chicago office wants you relocated by Wednesday. In 4 days, my life in Cedar Rapids would be over, and I'd become just another federal agent in a big city where nobody knew my history or my family's disappointment in my choices." At 4:45, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, trying to decide what to wear to the most important conversation of my life. Did you dress casually for the moment when you finally tell your family who you really are? Did you wear something professional to emphasize the career they'd never understood? In the end, I chose the same blue sweater I'd worn to my graduation from Quantico, hoping it might serve as armor against whatever was coming. The drive to my parents' house took 12 minutes through neighborhoods I'd known since childhood. Every street corner held memories of a simpler time when my biggest concern was whether I'd get accepted to college, not whether I'd survive long enough to see my undercover investigation through to its conclusion. Cars were already in the driveway when I arrived. Jake's silver Honda, Emma's red sedan with Iowa Methodist Hospital parking stickers, and a white pickup truck I didn't recognize but assumed belonged to Rebecca, Jake's girlfriend whom I'd met exactly 3 times in the past year. I sat in my car for a moment, gathering courage for what felt like the most dangerous operation of my career. Facing armed criminals had been easier than facing my family's questions about why I'd chosen to deceive them for 3 years. The front door opened before I reached it. My father stood there, his expression unreadable, wearing the same serious face he'd worn when I was 16 and had dented his car backing out of the garage. "Sarah," he said simply, stepping aside to let me enter. The scene in the living room was surreal. Emma sat on the couch still wearing her hospital scrubs, having apparently driven straight from her shift. Jake and Rebecca occupied the love seat, while my mother bustled around the kitchen with an energy that suggested she was either very excited or very nervous. "Sit down, honey," Mom called from the kitchen. "Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes, but we're going to talk first." I chose the armchair across from the couch, the same seat I'd occupied during countless family meetings over the years. But this time felt different. Instead of being the child being lectured about grades or curfews, I was the adult who'd spent 3 years protecting these people while they worried about my supposed failures. Dad settled into his recliner and fixed me with a look that I recognized from my childhood. The expression that meant he was about to ask questions that required honest answers. "Sarah, your mother and I have been married for 32 years. In that time, we've raised 3 children, weathered financial difficulties, health scares, and more family drama than any reasonable people should have to endure. But in all those years, we've never had to learn about our daughter's career from the evening news." The disappointment in his voice was different from what I'd grown accustomed to. This wasn't disappointment in my choices. This was disappointment in my honesty. "I know how this looks," I began, but Emma interrupted. Do you really? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you let us believe you were wasting your life for 3 years, while you were actually doing something incredible. It looks like you let Mom and Dad worry themselves sick about your future while you were out there protecting people and solving crimes." Emma's voice carried a mixture of hurt and admiration that I hadn't expected. As the family overachiever, she'd always been competitive with me, but I'd never considered how my apparent underachievement might have affected her sense of family dynamics. "I want to understand the timeline," Jake said, pulling out his phone. "You graduated from Georgetown in May 2021. When did you join the FBI?" "I was accepted to the academy in August 2021. I graduated from Quantico in January 2022 and was assigned to Chicago. I moved back to Cedar Rapids in June 2022 for the undercover assignment. So when you told us you were taking a job with a consulting firm," Mom's voice trailed off as she entered the room, carrying a tray of coffee that she set down with slightly shaking hands. "That was my cover story. I needed a legitimate reason to be in Cedar Rapids, and the consulting firm provided the perfect explanation for why I was asking detailed questions about local businesses and spending time reviewing financial records." Rebecca, who'd been quietly observing the family dynamics, leaned forward. "I work in marketing, so I deal with confidentiality agreements all the time, but this is on a completely different level. You couldn't tell anyone, not even your parents?" "Especially not my parents," I said, looking directly at my mother. "Mom, do you remember how worried you got when I was just applying for the FBI? How did you call me every day during the academy to make sure I was safe? If you'd known I was working undercover, investigating dangerous criminals, you would have been terrified every moment of every day for 3 years." Mom's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded slowly. "You're probably right about that." Dad cleared his throat, the sound that always preceded his most serious observations. "Sarah, I need you to help me understand something. When we expressed concern about your job, when we suggested other opportunities, you never gave us any indication that you were happy with your work. You let us believe you were settling for less than your potential." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. This was the heart of their hurt. Not that I'd deceived them about my career, but that I'd deceived them about my happiness and fulfillment. "I was happy," I said quietly. "Happier than I'd ever been in my life. Every day, I got to use everything I'd learned in college, everything I'd trained for at Quantico. I was making a real difference. Protecting people, bringing criminals to justice. But I couldn't tell you that without compromising the investigation and putting all of you at risk. So you chose to let us think you were miserable instead," Emma said, but her tone had softened. "I chose to protect you, all of you. The people we were investigating weren't just white-collar criminals shuffling papers around. They were connected to drug trafficking, human trafficking, violent crimes that reached across multiple states. If they'd discovered my real identity and decided to pressure me by threatening my family, I let the implication hang in the air. Everyone in the room understood what I was suggesting." Jake looked at Rebecca, then back at me. The day we were talking about Bob Thornton, when I mentioned the federal investigation. You already knew he'd been arrested, didn't you? I was the agent who arrested him. The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Mom spoke up. "Dinner's ready," she said, her voice subdued. "Let's eat. And then you can tell us everything you're allowed to tell us about what you've really been doing for 3 years." Dinner was a surreal experience. We passed meatloaf and mashed potatoes while I explained the basics of undercover work, money laundering investigations, and federal prosecutions. Rebecca asked thoughtful questions about how evidence gathering worked. Emma wanted to know about the physical dangers of the job. Jake was fascinated by the financial aspects of the case. But it was my father's questions that cut closest to the heart of everything. "Sarah, in all this time, when we were criticizing your choices and expressing disappointment in your direction, did you ever hate us for not understanding?" I set down my fork and considered the question carefully. "I never hated you, but I did hate the situation. I hated that I couldn't share the best parts of my life with the people I love most. I hated that your approval and pride meant everything to me, but I couldn't earn it without compromising everything I'd worked for." "You had our approval," Mom said fiercely. "You've always had our approval. We raised you to be independent, strong, capable of making your own decisions. We just wanted to make sure you were making decisions that would make you happy." "I was happy," I repeated. "Even when you thought I was failing, I was exactly where I belonged." After dinner, as we sat in the living room with coffee and Mom's famous apple pie, the conversation turned to practical matters. What would happen to the case? Where would I go next? How would the family handle the ongoing media attention? It was while I was reaching into my purse for my phone to show them some photos from my academy graduation that everything changed. I'd been carrying my service weapon and badge in a concealed holster and badge wallet every day for 3 years. They'd become as natural a part of my daily routine as putting on shoes or grabbing my keys. But tonight, emotional and exhausted from finally telling my family the truth, I'd been careless. When I pulled my hand out of my purse, the badge wallet came with it, caught on the strap of my phone case. It flew across the room in a perfect arc, landing with a metallic thunk on the hardwood floor directly in front of my father's chair. The wallet fell open, revealing the gold shield that had defined my identity for 3 years. Special Agent Sarah Mitchell, Federal Bureau of Investigation. For a moment, nobody moved. We all stared at the badge lying on the floor like it was an unexploded bomb. "Nick!" Then Dad reached down, picked it up, and studied it carefully. His fingers traced the edges of the shield, the raised letters, the official seal of the Department of Justice. "Special Agent Sarah Mitchell," he read aloud, his voice filled with something I'd never heard before. It wasn't disappointing. It wasn't concerned about my future or worrying about my choices. It was pride. Pure, uncomplicated, overwhelming pride. "My daughter, the FBI agent," he said, looking up at me with tears in his eyes. "Why didn't you tell us we raised a hero?" The word hero hung in the air like morning mist, transforming everything it touched. I watched my father hold my badge with the same reverence he'd once shown my college diploma, but this time his hands weren't shaking with nervousness about my future. They were trembling with the weight of finally understanding my present. "Dad, I'm not a hero," I said, reaching for the badge. "I'm just someone who does a job that requires keeping secrets." He pulled the badge back, not ready to let go of this tangible proof of who his daughter really was. "Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, you spent 3 years letting your family think you were throwing your life away, because telling us the truth might have put us in danger. If that's not heroic, then I don't know what is." Emma had been unusually quiet during the badge revelation, but now she stood up and walked to the window overlooking the backyard where we'd played as children. "I need to apologize to you," she said without turning around. "For 3 years I've been feeling sorry for you, poor Sarah, who couldn't get her life together like the rest of us. I actually felt superior, because I was in medical school while you were stuck in some dead-end office job." She turned to face me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "But you were saving lives while I was still learning how to save lives. You were already making the kind of difference I'm hoping to make someday." Jake was staring at his hands, processing revelations that were reshaping his understanding of everything. "Sarah, that day I came to your apartment asking about federal investigations. Did you think I suspected something? For about 10 minutes, I was terrified that you'd figured it out," I admitted. You work at the bank where some of the money laundering was happening. If you'd started asking the wrong questions to the wrong people, I could have accidentally blown your cover and endangered the investigation. Or worse, you could have become a target yourself. Rebecca had been absorbing the family dynamics with the fascination of someone witnessing a completely foreign culture. Sarah, can I ask you something personal? When your family was criticizing your job choices, when they were suggesting you weren't living up to your potential, how did you not just explode and tell them the truth? The question struck at the heart of what had been the most difficult part of the entire 3-year assignment. There were nights when I'd come home after testifying before a grand jury or after breaking up a human trafficking ring, and I'd have to listen to voicemails from Mom asking if I'd considered going back to school to find direction in my life. Those were the hardest moments. Mom looked stricken. "Oh, honey, we had no idea. You weren't supposed to have any idea, that was the point." But Rebecca, to answer your question, I didn't explode, because every time I wanted to defend myself, I'd remember what Agent Wells told me during my first interview. She said the Bureau becomes part of who you are, not just what you do. Living with your family's disappointment was part of the job, just like carrying a weapon or testifying in court. Dad carefully placed my badge on the coffee table, positioning it so everyone could see it clearly. "I need to know something, Sarah. When this assignment is over, when you transfer to Chicago or wherever they send you next, are you going to disappear from our lives again? Are we going to spend the next few years wondering what's really happening with our daughter?" The question revealed the deeper fear underneath all of their hurt feelings. They weren't just upset about being deceived. They were terrified of losing me to a world they couldn't understand or access. "The undercover work is over," I said. "My face has been on every news channel in Iowa. There's no putting that particular cat back in the bag. Whatever I do next, it's going to be as Sarah Mitchell, FBI agent, not as Sarah Mitchell, disappointed college graduate." Jake leaned forward. "What does that mean, practically speaking? Where will you live? What kind of work will you be doing?" "Chicago has offered me a position in their financial crimes unit. It would mean a promotion, better pay, and the kind of high-profile cases that can define a career. But it also means leaving Cedar Rapids, leaving all of you, starting over in a city where nobody knows my history." "Is that what you want?" Mom asked, her maternal instincts finally able to focus on my actual happiness instead of her perception of my failures. I'd been asking myself the same question for days, ever since Agent Thompson first mentioned the Chicago opportunity. I don't know. For 3 years, I've been dreaming of the day when I could be open about my work, when I could finally earn the recognition and respect I'd been secretly achieving. But now that it's here, the idea of leaving home feels more complicated than I expected. Emma sat back down, her medical training evident in the analytical way she approached emotional problems. "What are the alternatives? Could you stay in Iowa and work for the FBI in a different capacity? There's talk of opening a regional task force based in Des Moines, focused on financial crimes in smaller communities. It would be a step down in terms of prestige and case complexity, but it would mean staying close to family." "And that's important to you?" Dad asked. For the first time in 3 years, I was able to answer that question with complete honesty. More important than I realized. I spent 3 years protecting this family from the dangers of my real job, but in the process, I also protected myself from admitting how much I need you all in my life. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of cars pulling into the driveway. Through the front window, we could see news vans setting up equipment again, drawn by the presence of multiple family cars and the likelihood of getting a statement from the mysterious FBI agent who'd been living among them. "We should probably discuss how to handle the media attention," I said, watching reporters emerge from their vehicles like soldiers preparing for battle. Jake stood up and looked out the window with the expression of someone ready to defend his territory. "Actually, I think I'd like to give them a statement." "Jake, no," I said quickly. "Anything you say could be taken out of context or used to undermine the prosecution's case." "I'm not going to talk about your work or the investigation," he said, his voice carrying a determination I'd rarely heard from my younger brother. "I'm going to talk about my sister. The real Sarah Mitchell, not the cover story or the FBI agent, but the person who's been part of this family her whole life. Emma nodded slowly. Actually, I think that's a good idea. The media narrative right now is all about deception and secret identities. Maybe it's time for them to hear about who you really are as a person. Mom was already moving toward the kitchen, her crisis management instincts kicking in. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. Everyone needs to eat something first, and we need to agree on what we're comfortable sharing and what stays private. Dad picked up my badge one more time, studying it as if memorizing every detail. Sarah, I want you to know something. When I said we raised a hero, I wasn't just talking about your job. I was talking about the fact that you chose to sacrifice your own need for recognition and approval in order to protect other people. That's not something they teach at the FBI Academy. That's something that comes from the kind of person you've always been. The tears I'd been holding back for 3 years finally spilled over. I thought you were all disappointed in me. Disappointed? Mom laughed, though her own eyes were wet. Honey, we were worried about you because we love you and want you to be happy. But disappointed? Never. Confused, maybe. Concerned about your future, absolutely. But disappointed in who you are as a person? That's impossible. As we prepared to face the media circus outside, Jake pulled me aside. Sarah, I need to apologize for something specific. Remember last Christmas when I made that comment about how some people are content with mediocrity? I was talking about your job, but I realize now I was really talking about what I thought was your attitude toward achievement. Jake, you don't need to. Yes, I do. Because while I was judging you for what I thought was settling for less, you were actually achieving more than any of us. You were literally fighting crime while I was processing loan applications. And somehow, you managed to stay humble about it. The next hour was a masterclass in family solidarity. Jake, Emma, and my parents took turns speaking to the reporters, not about FBI operations or criminal investigations, but about their daughter and sister who had always been driven by a desire to help others. They talked about the volunteer work I'd done in high school, the way I'd tutored struggling classmates in college, the quiet acts of service that had characterized my entire life. Watching from the living room window, I saw my family in a new light. They weren't just the people who'd been disappointed in my apparent lack of ambition. They were the people who'd raised me to value service over self-promotion, integrity over recognition, and family over career advancement. Agent Thompson called as the last news van was pulling away. Sarah, I've been watching the coverage from Chicago. Your family just gave you the kind of character references that most agents never get, even after decades of service. They're good people, I said. Better than I gave them credit for. There's something else. The Des Moines Task Force position I mentioned? It's been approved. If you're interested, you could be the supervising agent for financial crimes across the entire state of Iowa. It would mean staying close to family while still doing meaningful work. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe normally. I'm very interested. Good. Because frankly, after watching your family defend your character on live television, I think Iowa would be lucky to keep you. That evening, as the family gathered in the living room one more time, the atmosphere was completely different from any family meeting we'd ever had. Instead of tension and unspoken concerns, there was a sense of completeness, as if a puzzle that had been missing crucial pieces for 3 years was finally whole. Dad raised his coffee mug in an impromptu toast. To Special Agent Sarah Mitchell, who taught us that sometimes the most important work happens in silence, and the greatest achievements are the ones nobody knows about. To family secrets that are finally not secret anymore, Emma added. To the best undercover agent Cedar Rapids has ever had, even though we never knew we had one, Jake contributed. Mom simply said, to my daughter, who never stopped being exactly who I raised her to be, even when we couldn't see it. As I looked around at my family, really seeing them for the first time in 3 years, I realized that Agent Wells had been right about the Bureau becoming part of who you are. But she'd missed something important. No matter how much the job changes you, no matter how many secrets you have to keep or sacrifices you have to make, family remains the constant that defines who you are underneath the badge. 3 years ago, I'd thought that protecting my family meant keeping them separate from my work. I'd learned that protecting them actually meant trusting them with the truth, even when that truth was complicated and dangerous. The FBI badge was still sitting on the coffee table, no longer a symbol of secrets kept, but of a life finally lived in the open. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, and new ways to serve and protect. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, I was simply Sarah Mitchell, daughter, sister, agent, and finally, someone my family could be proud of without reservation. The dead-end job they'd worried about had turned out to be the beginning of everything I was meant to become. And now, finally, we could all see the path clearly. 6 months later, I stood in my new office in Des Moines, looking out at the Iowa State Capitol building while reviewing case files that would have seemed impossible just a year ago. The regional task force had exceeded everyone's expectations, bringing together resources from 6 different agencies to combat financial crimes across the Midwest. My assistant knocked on the doorframe, holding a manila envelope marked "Personal and Confidential." "Agent Mitchell, this just arrived by courier from the Chicago field office." Inside was a letter from Robert Thornton's defense attorney, informing me that their client had agreed to cooperate fully with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. The information he was providing had already led to arrests in 4 additional states and the seizure of over $30 million in criminal assets. But it was the handwritten note at the bottom of the letter that made me smile. "Agent Mitchell, my client wanted me to convey his grudging respect for your professionalism during the investigation," he said, and I quote, "She played the role so well that I actually started thinking of her as a real auditor." Attorney David Walsh. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man I'd spent 18 months deceiving had developed a professional admiration for the very deception that brought down his criminal empire. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Family dinner Sunday, 5 p.m. Rebecca's bringing her famous lasagna. Emma has news to share. Don't be late, Special Agent Sister." The casual way my family now referenced my real job still caught me off guard sometimes. Where once they'd tiptoed around my mysterious career, now they asked direct questions about caseload, travel schedules, and whether I was taking proper safety precautions. The honesty was refreshing, even when Mom's protective instincts went into overdrive. That afternoon, I drove the 2 hours from Des Moines to Cedar Rapids, passing the exit for the car wash where I'd arrested Thornton. The building had been sold to new owners who'd painted it bright blue and added a sign advertising, quote, "Honest Abe's Auto Detailing, Clean Cars, Clean Conscience." I wondered if they knew about the building's history, or if they'd chosen the name as an unconscious response to its tainted past. Sunday dinner had evolved into a weekly tradition that none of us wanted to break. After 3 years of careful conversations and avoided topics, we discovered the joy of completely open communication. Jake brought case studies from the banking industry that sometimes overlapped with my investigations. Emma shared stories from the emergency room that gave me insights into drug trafficking patterns. Even Rebecca, now a regular fixture at family gatherings, contributed marketing perspectives that helped me understand how criminal organizations promoted their legitimate front businesses. "Sarah's here," Mom called out as I pulled into the driveway, her voice carrying the same enthusiasm she'd once reserved for Emma's medical school achievements, or Jake's banking promotions. Inside, the house smelled like Rebecca's famous lasagna and Dad's attempt at homemade garlic bread. Emma was setting the table with an energy that suggested good news, while Jake helped Rebecca navigate Mom's unnecessarily complicated kitchen layout. "Okay, Emma," Dad said as we gathered around the table, "you said you had news to share. Please tell me it doesn't involve moving to another state for another residency program." Emma grinned, practically bouncing in her seat. "Actually, it's the opposite. I've been accepted to the Trauma Surgery Fellowship at Iowa Methodist. I'm staying in Iowa." The celebration that followed was vintage Mitchell family. Loud, enthusiastic, and involving way too much emotion for a simple career announcement. But watching my parents' faces, seeing their joy at having another child choose to build their life close to home, I understood something I'd missed during my years of undercover work. Family isn't just about blood relations or shared history. It's about choosing to stay connected even when life offers easier alternatives. It's about prioritizing relationships over opportunities, communities over career advancement. "There's something else," Emma continued, her smile becoming almost secretive. "The fellowship includes a research component focusing on trauma patterns that might indicate domestic violence or human trafficking. Apparently, Having an FBI agent in the family gives me unique insights into criminal behavior indicators. Jake nearly choked on his water. Wait, you're saying Sarah's job is helping your medical career now? More than that, Emma said, looking directly at me. I've been asked to consult on a multi-agency task force that's developing protocols for medical professionals to identify and report suspected trafficking cases. They specifically requested someone with family connections to federal law enforcement. The pride in Dad's voice was unmistakable. So now we have 2 daughters whose careers involve fighting crime. 3. If you count Rebecca's work on financial marketing compliance, Mom added, making Rebecca blush. And Jake's fraud prevention initiatives at the bank, I pointed out, watching my brother's surprised expression. When did this family become a crime-fighting unit? Jake asked, but he was smiling. When we started being honest with each other about what we really do for work, I answered. After dinner, Dad and I found ourselves alone on the back porch, watching the sun set over the neighborhood where I'd grown up. The silence was comfortable, filled with 3 years' worth of conversations we could finally have. Sarah, I need to ask you something I should have asked months ago, Dad said, his voice serious. Do you ever regret the choices you made? The deception, the isolation, the years of letting us think you'd given up on your potential? I considered the question carefully, thinking about all the roads not taken, all the relationships that had suffered, all the moments of genuine family connection I'd sacrificed for operational security. I regret the pain it caused you and Mom, I said finally. I regret that Jake and Emma spent 3 years thinking they were more successful than their older sister. I regret that you worried about my future when I was actually building exactly the career I'd always dreamed of. But do you regret the choice itself? No. Because every day of those 3 years, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The Thornton investigation alone prevented millions of dollars from funding drug trafficking operations that would have destroyed communities across the Midwest. The intelligence we gathered has led to investigations in 12 states and 2 federal agencies. Dad nodded slowly. And the cost? The personal cost of living that kind of double life? Was worth it, I said without hesitation. Because ultimately, it led me back here. Not just geographically, but emotionally. I thought I had to choose between my family and my career, between being loved and being respected. I've learned that the choice was false. The people who really love you will respect you for who you are, not for who they think you should be. As we sat there in the gathering darkness, I thought about the badge that had started it all, the small piece of metal and leather that had fallen from my purse and changed everything. It was now framed on my office wall, not as a symbol of secrets kept, but as a reminder that truth, however delayed, always finds its way to the surface. The next morning, I would return to Des Moines to continue building cases that protected communities from financial predators. Emma would start her fellowship, learning to identify trafficking victims in emergency rooms. Jake would implement new fraud prevention protocols at his bank. And Mom and Dad would continue being proud of their children who'd chosen service over self-interest. But tonight, we were just a family enjoying dinner together, finally able to share our real lives instead of our carefully edited versions. The dead-end job had become a career path. The disappointment had transformed into pride, and the secrets that once divided us had become the foundation for deeper understanding. Sometimes the most important journeys are the ones that bring you home. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.